What one author have you discovered in the last 3 years that you would recommend?
Sinclair Ferguson. Everybody kept telling me about his books, and I said, well, I know the guy, but I don't need to read. I know everything he's going to say. And then I started reading them, and they're just great. I just want to...
Has Tim Keller written any books?
You mean besides each other, you mean?
You're free to answer as the Spirit moves.
3 years. Was it that we would recommend, though? Is that the idea? Oh. Yeah. I actually do think that as I've gotten older, I've discovered a lot of great authors that I would not recommend. This is just, maybe this isn't all that interesting to you, but as I've gotten older, your mind is like a tree in that, when you cut a tree, there's rings to it. And the old trees have lots of rings, and the young trees have one or two. In the beginning, when you're still being formed, it's actually, you do have to be somewhat careful about what you read, because it absolutely becomes part of you for a long time. And as you get older, the things you read don't sink in quite the same way, because you're getting more and more formed. And as I've gotten older, I've profited a great deal from reading authors that 30% of what they say is unbelievably great, and you're not going to find it anywhere else. But more than 2/3 of it is really not very good, or in some parts of it are toxic. So as I've gotten older, I felt free and able to actually profit from people who I wouldn't recommend, and certainly not because I would say, if you suddenly get excited and get into there, I wouldn't want them to come into the center of your tree. I wouldn't mind it if some of what they say was one of the outer rings. It would probably enhance, but I wouldn't want it there at the core. So, I'll just give you an example of that. Would be a guy called Terry Eagleton. Do you know who Terry Eagleton is? He's
Yeah, I do.
Irish Marxist, ex-Catholic who I have recently enjoyed. Tom Nagel at NYU, even John Gray, and Terry Eagleton, all of whom don't like secularism, even though they all say they're basically atheists or agnostics. In other words, they hate secularism. They see the sham of it. They can't. They're looking for transcendence. They can't quite bring themselves to embrace God. Now, what that means is that they're like what Francis Schaeffer used to call co-belligerents. So when they critique their own people, their own secular society, it's gold. It gives you apologetic material. It's just wonderful. And even their longings are to some degree interesting, because I say, I'd love to talk to this person, or you're helping me talk to other people, like other non-Christians like you. Nevertheless, I wouldn't want to dump any of those thinkers right now on younger people who ought to be reading. They ought to be reading Bavinck, rather than wading through all of that.
Yeah, I think you should come to a stage in growth where, even in terms of commentaries you use, there should always be one that you know that you will not disagree, you will not agree with this man theologically.
Yeah, good.
Because you will therefore be hopefully stimulated to think more creatively. And I think that's actually,
good. Yeah.
Creativity can be a good thing and a bad thing, but I think often if you confine yourself to the people you know you will agree with, you dry up in terms of your creativity and what I would think of as your imaginative skills. So I think that's important. That said, of course, I've never read anything that was written after 1688. So, in the last few years, I've actually found myself going back to books I read in my teens and early 20s. One book that has made a huge impression on me that I'm actually ashamed to confess I've never read it before, is the biography of Alexander Duff, who was a great Scottish missionary in the first part of the 19th century. You know, I think one of the things I've noticed in seminaries, if you read, for example, David Calhoun's 2 volumes on Princeton Seminary, there's a whole era in Princeton Seminary when the men were lining up to go to serve Christ outside of the United States. And they were dying, and the more of them were lining up to do that. And I was thinking in bed the other night, because I was reading about Duff in bed, that I thought, you know, if I had any influence on a seminary now, I would make it a required course to have a course in missionary biography. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I've been doing is been going back to the memoirs or biographies or autobiographies of men about whom we know now, but who laboured in very obscure parts of Scotland. Thinking particularly of Samuel Rutherford and Thomas Boston's. If you wanted to find the church where Thomas Boston was minister, you need to leave the highway, turn left, go through a valley, alongside a river, into the mountains, and eventually turn right. And there's this little church there. And he is such an illustration to me, and I think ought to be an illustration to anyone called into the ministry. At the end of the day, it's not where you are that matters, it's who you become where you are. You know, I think that's just, it's just, you know, as you get old and realize how little you have done, it kind of puts even the little you have done in perspective.